With a fixed 2.8 aperture, a very controlled focus breathing, and a quiet STM focus motor, no wonder video shooters are raving about this lens. Hi everyone, this footage was shot with the Sigma 18 to 50mm f2.8 and the Sony FX30. The weather hasn't been great here lately, but I kind of did my best to gather some interesting looking shots and footage, even spicing things up with a smoke machine to give you something interesting to watch other than this type of test footage, which we'll take a look at in just a minute. But first, a quick thank you to Sigma Nordic for lending me this lens. This is not a sponsored video, I reached out to them. And I'm also working on a comparison video between the Sigma 18 to 50 and the Tamron 17 to 70. And let me tell you, after using both of these two lenses now for a while, they're actually pretty different, these two lenses. They kind of cater to different types of gigs or video shooters, and that video will be coming out next week. I still have some more tests that I want to include in this video before I finalize everything, but this video is going to be all about the Sigma 18 to 50mm f2.8. So let's take a closer look. First of all, this here is a tiny little lens. Let me show you. I have the Canon STM 18 to 55 here, the kit lens, and let's just compare them side by side like this, and you can see how tiny the Sigma lens really is. I thought this lens was pretty much as small as they come, but clearly Sigma made it work in something even smaller. So this lens comes in at 290 grams, making it very compact and travel friendly. But if I were to complain about something at this point, you know, right off the bat, it would be the size and the position of the focus wheel for when you want to do things like manual focus, which, believe it or not, you often do when you're shooting video. Even if you have great, reliable autofocus on your camera, there's oftentimes things that you want to shoot or keep in focus that won't necessarily work with autofocus. So for those times, manual focus is the way to go. But I get it, a lens this small, there's obviously going to be a limited amount of space, and it's going to dictate how big you can make the focus wheel, the zoom wheel, and all that fun stuff. So I get it. It's just, you know, if we want to call this a review, then we have to, you know, find things to complain about. That's what we do. Anyway, let's move on. So the focus ring has a pretty nice feel to it. It's what you'd expect from kind of a modern day lens, which isn't necessarily made for manual focusing. So it will have, you know, that modern day lens feel. There's no stops to this lens obviously either. It's focused by wire and all that fun stuff. But yeah, it's, you know, it still works. The zoom wheel here, same thing. And as you can see, the lens barrel kind of extends when you're zooming like this. Okay, so let's try the 18 to 50 on a gimbal. So I have the lens at around 35mm, so roughly halfway out there. And as you can see, it's looking fairly balanced. I didn't spend too much time on this, but let's bring the barrel into 35 and power on the gimbal like so, just to see what happens. So yeah, it's powered on. We're not going to do any calibrations or anything. So here we go. 35mm works great. I can't feel any vibration or any straining on the motors. Let's go to 18mm just for fun. Same thing here at 18mm, no problems whatsoever. And now the moment we've all been waiting for, 50mm. So here we are at 50, and let's try it out. Same thing here, steady. I can't feel any vibrations or any stress from the motors or anything. That's it for the outside. I think there's one more thing, but I think we'll talk about that later on in this video. Now, speaking of gimbals and stabilization and all that thing, this lens, because of its tininess, don't have any built-in optical image stabilization. So, you know, if you want to have, you know, stabilized footage, you either have to use a camera with a stabilized sensor, or, you know, use a gimbal or stabilize your footage in post if needed. And by the way, speaking of size, I just wanted to mention this little monstrosity here. I only had one 55mm step-up ring, and this step-up ring had a sky filter stuck to it. So yeah, I doubt there will be any major impacts on the overall image quality, but in case you're wondering why there's an extra piece of glass on the front of the lens, that's why. But anyway, the one drawback with using third-party lenses with Sony's newer cameras is that you can't take advantage of the new focus breathing compensation, which only works with Sony's own lenses. That said, the focus breathing on this lens is actually very well controlled, and I think that's something that a lot of, especially new video shooters, may overlook when they're shopping for a video lens. Having something that's supported by the focus breathing compensation if you're on Sony, or something that have very little focus breathing in the actual lens itself. So take a look at this footage. I can't say that I see any major shifts in the image while we're jumping between close focus and infinity. I'm gonna go ahead and let this roll for a couple of more seconds so we can get a few more attempts at this. But take a look at the background and see the trees and everything here, and see if you can spot any kind of zoom in or zoom out effect when we change the focus here. Now, the autofocus is definitely on par with pretty much everything else on this lens. I did some tests here just to give you guys a few examples real quick, and I'm kind of sorry about the junk on the screen here, but I was in a bit of a hurry as the sun were going down and everything, so I hope you can still see. I think it's quite easy to see the little boxes here anyway, but I will keep that in mind and do better next time. And the same thing here, the autofocus is very smooth. There's no stutters or hesitation or jumps when it's grabbing focus of me or changing the focus to the background. Everything looks very, very smooth. And while we're on autofocus, I also want to touch on the STM motor, which is also obviously very smooth and quiet. And I've not heard the autofocus being picked up by the internal microphones on the camera, not even during this test that we just looked at here. But just for comparison, to show you guys how bad this can be sometimes, here's a quick sample of the legendary Sigma 1835, where you can clearly hear the focus motors working.
Lens, we can push those 10 inches. You can hear the autofocus working.
Now, before we move on to my list of kind of pros and cons, I wanted to show you the optical performance real quick. There's not a whole lot to report here. There's not a whole lot of things to complain about. There's tiny amounts of loca or longitudinal chromatic aberration, and just a tiny bit of regular chromatic aberration here and there, especially when you start to push this lens in some high contrast situation, when you're getting up close to your subject and that kind of stuff. But for video where you won't be staring at a single freeze frame like you would on a photograph, the issues with chromatic aberration, in my opinion, isn't a major issue. Same thing with flaring. It's also very well controlled. As you can see here, you kind of have to work a tiny bit to get this lens to flare out, or if you're looking to get those kind of veiling flares, if you're into flaring and that kind of stuff, you can make it flare, obviously, as you can see here, but it's generally very well controlled. Now, there's more examples of this lens in action in that comparison video that I talked about in the beginning of this video, where we will, you know, make this go head to head with the Tamron 17-70. So, you know, like I said, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that. Now, let's close this video out with my list of pros and cons, and I think we'll start with the pros. And I think I have 3 pros that I want to bring up in this video. So the first one is going to be the size and the weight of this lens. Sure, you won't be impressing any clients rolling up to a gig with this tiny little lens attached to your camera, but you know, if you're not worried about dressing to impressing and that kind of stuff, you know, it's a great lens. And for things like travel videography, hiking, and obviously for gimbal work, the compact size and the low weight is going to be a huge plus. The second pro that I wanted to bring up here is going to be the image quality. The image quality of this lens and the optical performance overall is obviously great. Sigma knows what they're doing. This lens will probably cut great with bigger and more affordable and more expensive full frame lenses if you're thinking about using this lens for a B camera, if you're doing things like 2 camera setups for interviews and corporate videos and that kind of stuff. Same thing here with the autofocus performance. You're getting a very smooth and reliable autofocus, and the STM motors or motor, I don't know how many they are actually, but that STM motor is very quiet if you want to use this for vlogging and you don't have an external microphone or anything. I would recommend always use some sort of external mic, but sometimes you just have to work with what you have at the moment. Now, let's move on to my short list of cons, and the very first thing on my list here is going to be the lack of optical image stabilization. Now, even if you have a camera with a stabilized sensor, having a stabilized lens for video is going to make your life so much easier. You know, keep in mind that you're adding an extra crop to the lens, to the image, when you're applying things like digital image stabilization to that. We're saying like a 27mm full frame equivalent. So that could obviously create some problems for those situations where you need to be able to go super wide and you're already at like 27mm equivalent and cropping in on that if you want to be able to use like active mode or any of that stuff. So yeah, that's something that I would like you to take in consideration when considering this lens. The second con that I have on my list is going to be the no weather sealing. There is a tiny little mount gasket here on the back of the mount on this lens, but this lens isn't fully sealed. So if you have a weather sealed camera body like FX30 and you want to be able to take advantage of that weather sealing in various shooting conditions, whether it's raining, snowing, or what have you, Sigma does not classify this lens as fully weather sealed. If you were to twist my arm and ask for a third little entry on the cons list, I would have to say that the lack of an AF-MF switch here on the lens barrel is a bit of a shame when we're looking at lenses, especially for video. That's a bit of a shame, but then again, I see a lot of lenses coming out on the market these days that don't have any switches or any buttons on the lens barrel. So it's not like Sigma went against the tide here or anything, but I don't know, does that count like a half a con or maybe a third of a con or something? I don't know, but that would be my third entry on the cons list. So based on all this, I don't know if you can, but I think I can see why so many videographers are interested in this lens. You're getting a great image quality and an overall well-performing lens with a 27 to a 75mm full frame equivalent and a fixed 2.8 aperture. That's also one of the kind of key features that you should be looking for if you're looking at zoom lenses like this. A f2.8 fixed aperture is going to make sure that your exposure is going to be solid and stay the same throughout the focal range and all that fun stuff. So all this for very little money. I would like to keep this lens, but sadly I have to send it back to Sigma. Maybe I'll get my own copy down the road, or Maybe I'll ask Sigma and see if I can borrow this lens again during spring or summer when it's going to be a bit more interesting to shoot and gather more example pictures. But that's all I had for you today. Check out the links in the description where I've listed all the available mount versions for this lens. There's currently an E mount, an X mount, and L mount version available, and I'm gonna leave links to all of those down below. These lenses are often on a sale, so check out those links and see if you can snag one for cheap right now. Otherwise, thank you for watching, thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.